Alright, so I'm going back to the writing of this book just to show a little bit about I guess it's manuscript, and they used this from the time of the Romans with the F and the S switch. Like here it says infects, it actually is insects. Where it's skillful, it's not fearful, it's skillful. So it's not impossible to read, but it sometimes gets a little difficult on specific text. Now this is later on. This particular bit of the set is actually online. The one I'm reading is not. So I don't know. Well, at here where it says, wished is whiffed and all of this, them to say. So it just gives you an idea of the actual book itself, but that's the next of it. The next in the set. We also have here when they switched from the F to the S, so this is a bit of history about it. This book was published in 1791. So when you're thinking about it, 1791, it's probably right here in the middle of this time. This is when the S was still, the S, and then the S came into fashion that we know it today, and this is the F still in fashion. So it was still pretty normal when he was publishing it, when this particular author was gathering everything. It was normal. So he wasn't actually out of step in time. And yet, immediately, pretty much, like 5 years after, it became out of fashion. So it was almost like all that work was like, we're the yes now, we're the yes now. So it came with like a bad, a bad launch. If you think about it, it was pretty much a bad launch. It was at the end of its peak. And yet, if you think about it in terms of like a market, who knew? This was like 100 years. This was since the Rome. Who knew that would be the end of the market of the long S? So it was bad for him, wasn't it? Because there's no way he could have altered it. No way. There's just way too much data. All right, so we're on to the William the Conqueror, also William the First of England, the King of England. No, he's not the most good-looking bloke, that's for sure. And yeah, they keep showing this guy, and that's completely different from this guy. I don't know. Anyway, this image possibly is, and this one here, the Alame one. These are more consistent with the face. I believe he's an imposter. So. Yay. So what else about this particular... Now here they have him as a redhead, which is another, who knows if he did have red hair. A lot of them don't have him with red hair, so... Here we have the illustration of a humorous one where he's really thin. So anyway, that's really all I've got out of William here. And yes, he did have 2 sons as the King of England. Down here we've got Oh no, this isn't him. This is William II, his successor. No. King of England, blah, blah, blah. No, his children. We're talking about the children of William. We have Henry, sorry, I was right. Henry the First, and then we have William II. So anyway, I'll leave you on the silly images. Yeah, very interesting how they were out of fashion with the F to the S all of a sudden after the launch of this book. Really odd in a way, if you think about it. Okay, so I'll go back to the beginning of this particular paragraph. In 1087, for some years a perfect peace prevailed between the French and English monarchs, which was at length interrupted by the account received by William of some idle railleries, with which Philip had indulged himself at his expense. William, who had become extremely corpulent, had been confined for some weeks to his bed by sickness, which led Philip to express a hope that his brother of England would soon be delivered of his great beli, and enabled to quit his chamber. This sarcasm, being reported to the king, threw him into a violent passion, and made him swear, by the splendour and resurrection of God, his usual oath, he would say, that the first time he should go abroad, he would light up as many torches at Saint Genevieve to celebrate his recovery, as should give but little satisfaction to Philip, alluding to the usual practice at that time of women after childbirth, who, when they were churched, always presented a certain number of lighted candles. Nor did he fail to put his menace in execution, for immediately on his recovery he entered the Isle of France, and at the head of the powerful army, at a time when the harvest was ripe for gathering, and laid waste the whole country with fire and sword, he laid siege to Mantes, and having taken it by a fault, first plundered the town, and then reduced it to ashes, with all the churches and monasteries it contained. But the destructive progress of these hostilities was impeded by an accident, which soon after put an end to William's existence. His horse, suddenly starting, threw him on the pommel of the saddle, by which he received a dangerous bruise, and being extremely heated at the time, and likewise in a bad habit of body, he began to be apprehensive of the consequences, and ordered himself to be conveyed in a litter to the Abbey of Saint Gervais at Rouen, where he expired on the 9th of September 1087, in the 63rd year of his age, and the 21st of his reign. In 1091, the death of this prince delivered Philip from a formidable enemy, and the dominions of the deceased monarch were contested by his 3 sons. Of these, the second, William Rufus, by the dying breath of his father, was recommended to the throne of England. But for the possession of it, he was probably more indebted to the attachment of Eudes, the minister of the late king, who delivered into his hands the royal treasures, than to the favourable opinion of a sovereign who had never acquired the affections of his subjects. Robert, the eldest, succeeded to Normandy and Maine, and to Henry was only bequeathed a sum of money. Yet Rufus, not content with the crown which Robert had a right to expect, invaded soon after the Duchy of Normandy. The latter was faintly supported by Philip of France and by the cession of EU, Faucamp and Cherbourg, purchased a disadvantageous peace which permitted him to retain the remainder of his inheritance. In 1094 and 1095, while these transactions were passing in France, the kingdom of Spain was a prey to every species of rapine and disorder. The Saracens were in possession of Lusitania, Murcia, Andalusia, Valencia, Granada, and Tortosa, and their only Asturia, a part of Old Castile, Barcelona, one half of Catalonia. The Christians had only Asturia, a part of Old Castile. Let's go back. Tortosa and their territories extended beyond the mountains of Castile and Saragossa. The Christians then had only Asturia, a part of Old Castile, Barcelona, one half of Catalonia, Navarre, and a portion of Aragon. Too weak to oppose by themselves the power of Mussulmans, they frequently implored the aid of France, and Philippe sent several armies to their assistance. William, Duke of Aquitaine, and Hugh, Duke of Burgundy, particularly signalized their zeal and courage in these pious exhibitions, whence they returned laden with wealth and glory. But all of their French princes who distinguished themselves on this occasion, only one laid the foundation of a lasting establishment. This was Henry, son to Robert, Duke of Burgundy, great-grandson to Hugh Capet, who displayed so much valour and rendered such important services to Alfonso VI, King of Castile, that the monarch gave him one of his daughters in marriage, and ceded to him the county of Porto, which the Spaniards had just conquered from the Moors. From him are descended the present royal family of Portugal, a name which was substituted for Lusitania, and which was taken from the towns of Porto and Carl, both of which were rebuilt by the French conqueror. The tranquillity which prevailed in France afforded leisure to Philip to pursue those pleasures to which he was naturally addicted. Unfortunately, they were not calculated to amuse, but to enervate the mind. The queen had by this time lost her powers of pleasing, and the king, though he had several children by her, was resolved to procure a divorce. A distant and doubtful degree of consanguinity afforded the pretence, and the unhappy princess, banished to Montreal, expired of a broken heart. The King of France next demanded in marriage Emma, the daughter of Count Roger, brother to Robert Guichard, Duke of Sicily. The lady, richly adorned with jewels and liberally portioned, was escorted to the French court, but to the disgrace of Philip does the historian record that Emma was dismissed and her fortune retained. His passions had been inflamed by Bertrande de Montfort, the wife of Foulques, Count of Anjou, who, with the assistance of the king, had supplanted his elder brother, Geoffrey. This woman was endowed with a great portion of sense, but her ambition was inordinate. She was imperious or supple, grave or gay, prude or coquette, according to the taste of her lover. It was with the greatest regret that she had consented to sacrifice her youth. To an infirm old man. In temper, morose, and oppressed with disease was this old man. The moment she apprised of the king's divorce, she sent a person to whom she could confide, with a proposal to her sovereign to carry her off and then marry her. She relied for success on the fame of her charms, and the event justified her confidence. The Bishop of Bayeux was base enough to marry them, and was richly rewarded for the degrading task. But so flagrant a violation of every moral and civil tie could not escape the censure of Pope Urbain II. In a council holden at Autun, a sentence of excommunication was pronounced against the king, unless he parted from Bertrade. His ready promise of submission averted, or rather suspended, the thunders of the Vatican. Suspended the thunders of the Vatican. But the death of Bertha induced him to recall Bertrade, who was solemnly crowned by 2 French bishops. Pascal II, who had succeeded Urbain in the chair of St. Peter, immediately sent 2 cardinals into France, with orders to assemble a council at Poitiers, for the purpose of renewing the censures of the Church. But the face of affairs was now essentially changed. Philip had recovered his liberty by the death of his wife. The Count of Anjou had acknowledged that his own marriage was defective. The prelates exclaimed loudly against the arrogance of the sovereign pontiff, who had assumed an absolute authority over the affairs of France. and the nobles began to be aware of the danger that must accrue to themselves if the court of Rome was permitted to extend her encroachments. William VIII, Count of Poitiers and Duke of Aquitaine, who publicly kept a mistress, was most violent in his opposition to the proceedings of the legate. He declared before all the members of the council that he would never suffer his sovereign to be excommunicated in his presence, and finding his endeavours to counteract their designs fruitless and unavailing, he left the church, followed by a few of the bishops, several of the nobles, and a part of the people who treated the Pope's ministers with great indignity. They even proceeded to acts of violence. A stone was thrown at one of the cardinals, which broke the head of a priest. A priest that sat by his side. All then was clamour and tumult. Most of the bishops fled with precipitation, but some remained, and the legates stayed to pronounce the sentence of excommunication against the king. It must not, however, be supposed that, as some authors have asserted, the throne was declared vacant. The French were absolved from their oath of fidelity, or that the kingdom was laid under an interdict. This opinion was probably founded on the mode which then prevailed of dating public deeds done in the reign of Jesus Christ, reigning in France, but it had demonstrated by writers of eminence that long before his divorce Philip made use of his pious form, and that it was often employed as well before his as since his time. Service was performed as usual, with the doors of the church open. The sacraments were administered in public, and the kings had even obtained permission from the bishops to have Mass said before him. The only effect of his communication was, if a contemporary author may be credited, who was given a very particular account of it, his excommunication was that the service was read in a low voice, and when the king was present, with the doors shut, and on solemn festivals, he was no longer crowned by the prelates of his kingdom, except by those of Belgia, who would never consider him as an excommunicated person. Still, however, it afforded a plausible pretext for revolt to such of his vassals as were so disposed, for which reason he resolved to associate his son, Louis, to the throne. A prince of 19, possessed of great courage and endued with a portion of wisdom that is seldom to be met with at so early an age. In 1103 to 1105, while Philip passed his hours in the alternate enjoyments of love and wine, his kingdom was doomed by her miseries to atone for the vices of her sovereign. the barons once more assumed the tone of independence. The scenes of anarchy and confusion from which France had been rescued by the prudence of Hugh Capet and his successors were again presented in every province, and the dignity of the crown, which had been degraded by the follies of their father, was restored by the virtues of the son. From their fortified castles, the nobles issued forth like a band of plunderers, and committed the most daring depredations. On the public roads, laying all passengers without the smallest discrimination of age, sex, or station, under a cruel contribution. It was not longer possible to travel but in caravans, and even the king himself did not he did not dare to pass from Paris to Etampes without a strong guard. The capital was in manner blocked up by 7 or 8 small towns, the lords of which kept regular bodies of troops that scoured the surrounding country, and these tyrants became more formidable from their union, which was closely cemented by the ties of blood and more powerful bonds of interest. Louis deemed it necessary to make every exertion for repressing disorders which threatened the kingdom with destruction. With a small but well-disciplined force, he continually kept the field, and overawed the nobles who had disdained the authority of his father. He razed their castles, redressed the injuries of their dependents, and compelled them to relinquish the hands which they had ravished from the church. The banks of the Seine and the Loire alternately attested his indefatigable zeal, and the presumption of the haughty nobility was repressed and chastised by a cautious yet enterprising prince. These glorious achievements of Louis not only established his reputation, but rendered him highly formidable to the few barons who still resisted his power. Guy Truffel, one of the most determined plunderers in the kingdom, dreading the effects of his resentment, offered to cede to him the castle of Montlhéry, on condition that Philip, the king's son of Bertrade, should do him the honor to accept his daughter's hand. So now they're mingling the barons with royalty. Well, they've done it before, but they're doing it again. As this fortress was deemed impregnable, and the king had long been anxious to get possession of it, the proposal of Guy was accepted with joy, and Louis became master of a place which had for years proved the terror of the surrounding country and broken off the communication between Paris and Orléans. But all of these petty wars, and most glorious for Louis, was that which he carried on with Guy, Count of Rochefort. This nobleman, being a great favourite with Philip, had persuaded the king to marry Louis to his daughter Lucienne. But before the marriage was consummated, it was opposed on the plea of consanguinity, and declared null by the Roman pontiff Pascal II at the Council of Troy. The father resented the facility with which Louis acquiesced in the determination of the Pope, and, encouraged by Theobald, Count of Champagne, erected the standard of revolt, plundered the traitors who were under the king's protection. Well, and here they're not traitors, they're more traders who were under, so I'm not sure if they're speaking of traders of business or rather just traitors that were under the king's protection. So that could be either or. And secured his spoils in the castle of Gournay upon the Marne. Louis immediately assembled his little army and advanced with a determination to lay siege to the fortress. Having forced the passage of the river, where he met with considerable resistance, he drove the rebels from their entrenchments and compelled them to take refuge within the walls of the castle. The garrison, after some time beginning to experience a scarcity of provisions, treated with contempt the remonstrances of Guy, and had resolved on capitulating when the courts of Champagne hastened to their relief with a numerous army. But Louis immediately attacked him, and having gained a glorious and decisive victory, returned to the castle, which surrendered, and was transferred by the victor to the lords of Garlande. Louis, either from curiosity or to avoid the dangerous enmity of his mother-in-law, obtained permission to visit England. Yay, get to visit England. He was received by Henry, who on the death of his brother, William Rufus, had possessed himself of the sovereignty of that island, to the exclusion of Robert of Normandy, who was absent in Palestine, with every mark of respect. Even here, if we can credit the testimony of concurring historians, the implacable hatred of Bertrade pursued him, and by a letter subscribed with the name of Philip, and sealed with the royal signet, the King of England was requested to retain his Gust in confinement, or extinguish the dread of his return by death. It's not easy to visit England, apparently. But Henry, however, addicted to cruelty and injustice where his interest or ambition was concerned, refused to violate the sacred rites of hospitality, and delivered the letter which contained the fatal secret to Louis himself. The prince immediately hastened to his father, and throwing himself at his feet, told him he had brought him the criminal whom he had consigned to destruction. Philip was entirely ignorant of what had passed, and expressed his detestation of the horrid attempt. But his love for Bertrade made him reject his son's demand of justice on her head, and Louis, by his display of his resentment, only increased the inveterate enmity of his abandoned woman, who determined at all events to procure the gratification of her revenge. For this purpose, she applied to a faithful servant, who found means to administer poison to Louis, the strength of whose constitution for a long time seemed overpowered with the violence of the noxious draught. At length, however, he was relieved from his sufferings by the skill of an obscure physician, who was treated as an ignorant quack by the facility of Paris. But the effect of the whole medicines bespoke the extent of his knowledge. Louis, justly enraged at this new desperate attack upon his life, would have immediately inflicted on Bertrade, with his own hand, that punishment which her crimes so justly merited, had he not been prevented by his father, who again succeeded on his attempts to promote a reconciliation between them. In order to appease his rage, the king ceded to his son the town of Pontoise, with all the Vexin Francois, and an advantage so considerable as enraged him to smother his resentment. So I'm not sure what happened with the poison there. The Pope, in the meantime, had come to France, and Philip had sent to inform him that he was willing to submit to any penance he might think proper to impose, but on condition that he would grant him the necessary dispensation for rendering his marriage lawful and joyful. A council was convened for this purpose at Beaugeny, where the king and Bertrade promised to hold no farther commerce with each other till the church had come to a decision on the subject of their union. But the members of the council were afraid to deliver their sentiments, and after disputing for a considerable time, they separated without coming to any determination on the business of which they had met. The king complained bitterly of the insult he had sustained, and many of the French prelates wrote to the Pope, who dispatched 2 legates with orders to assemble a new council at Paris, at which Philip was at length absolved from all censures, and his marriage confirmed, which was the conclusion of an affair which threatened to interrupt the national tranquillity, but which only served to display the wisdom of some of the French prelates, and to show the good qualities of Louis. We now come to an event which occurred during the transactions we have been relating, and which claims our particular notice, as well from its influence on all the nations of Europe, as from the essential part taken in it by the French. The Crusades, or expeditions, formed for the purpose of rescuing the Holy Land from the hands of the infidels, seemed to be the first event that roused Europe from the lethargy in which it had been long sunk, that tended to introduce any change in government or in manners. So we're starting into the Inquisition. Okay, so the Crusades, I will read this last sentence again, The Crusades, or expeditions formed for the purpose of rescuing the Holy Land from the hands of the infidels, seemed to be the first event that roused Europe from the lethargy in which it had been long sunk, and that it tended to introduce any change in government or in manners. So the Crusades, now you look back in history and you go, oh yes, that one went off to Constantinople, went over to Greece, or blah blah blah. It's all about this. I just plunked up Matilda as she is. She's the wife of William William I, King of England, and she is mother to two of the kings of England, Henry and William II. The human mind is naturally inclined to dwell with a degree of enthusiastic delight that borders on veneration on those places which are entitled to distinction, either as the residence of some illustrious character or as the scene of some glorious transaction. Hence proceeded that superstitious devotion with which the Christians, from the earliest ages of the Church, were accustomed to visit. They were accustomed to visit that country which the deity had selected as the inheritance of his favourite people, and in which the Son of God had accomplished the redemption of mankind. The great expense, fatigue, and danger which necessarily attended a pilgrimage to so distant a country considerably added to the merit of the undertaking, and soon made it be considered as a sufficient atonement for the most flagrant offences. So you go on these pilgrimages and it's like a get-out-of-jail-free card from what you've done. Okay. An opinion which was diffused over Europe with an astonishing rapidity about the close of the 10th and commencement of the 11th century, which obtained universal belief. It caused a wonderful augmentation of the number of credulous pilgrims, and increased the ardour with which they undertook this useless voyage. The 1,000 years mentioned by St. John in the 20th chapter of the Revelations were now supposed to be accomplished, and the end of the world to be, consequently, approaching. So everyone's thinking this is it, doomsday, soon. We learn from many of the ancient historians, preserved by Martin Bouquet, a Benedictine monk, in his collection of the historians of France, that about this period mankind was seized with a general consternation that induced great numbers to relinquish their possessions and abandon their friends and families, to hasten with the utmost precipitation to the Holy Land, where they imagined that Christ would very soon appear to sit in judgment upon the sins of the world. Give up everything and go. It's the last chance. Christ is going to be there. Right. While the Arabians continued in possession of Palestine, their caliphs encouraged the resort of pilgrims to Jerusalem, justly deeming that species of commerce as highly beneficial to the country, which brought considerable importations of gold and silver, and exported nothing but useless relics and consecrated baubles. But the Turkomans, the middle of the 11th century. The Turkomans are, well, they're all Turks called, the Turks, a tribe of Tartars who had embraced the tenets of Mahomet, having about the middle of the 11th century taken Syria from the Saracens and made them themselves masters of Jerusalem. Pilgrims were exposed to every kind of insult and outrage from these barbarians. This revolution occurred at the very time when pilgrimages from the cause above mentioned had become more frequent, filled Europe with indignation and alarm. The religious travelers, on their return from Palestine, did not fail to relate the dangers they had experienced in visiting the holy city, and to describe the cruelty and vexations of the Turks in terms of exaggeration proportioned to the magnitude of their fears. When the minds of men were thus prepared, the misguided zeal of the fanatical monk, who conceived the idea of leading all the forces of Christendom against the infidels, and of effecting their expulsion from the Holy Land, was sufficient to enforce the adoption of that wild enterprise. Gregory VII had, indeed, formed the design of leading all the Western Christians against the Mahometans. The Mahometans were but the overbearing disposition of the imperious prelate, and they had created him such numerous enemies and rendered every scheme he proposed so suspicious that he was able to make little progress in the promotion of his plan, which was left to be completed by an inferior personage, whose station of life prevented him from becoming an object of jealousy or mistrust. Peter the Hermit, or Coussoupetre, as he is called in the memoirs of the Princess Anna, who was daughter of the Emperor Alexis Comnena, a native of Amiens, which was the capital of Picardy, had made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and witnessed the dangers and inconveniences to which the pilgrims were exposed. These inspired him with the idea of putting the Christians in possession of Palestine. Yes, if we can take Palestine, it's all better. And to urge them to the undertaking, he ran from the province to Provence with a crucifix in his hand, exciting both princes and people to his holy war. And wherever he came, he enkindled the same enthusiastic ardor for the exception as glowed within his own bosom. The Council of Placentia, summoned at the instigation of Peter by Pope Martin II, where 4,000 ecclesiastics and 30,000 seculars were assembled, pronounced the scheme to have been suggested by the immediate inspiration of heaven. In a subsequent council, holden at Clermont in Auvergne, which was still more numerous and attended by the most powerful princes, nobles, and prelates of Europe, the question was no sooner proposed than the whole assembly exclaimed with one voice, "It is the will of God! It is the will of God!" The tan oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I was really like, I was perishing myself. I hadn't eaten, and the first half of this reading, I was a mess. And then I went and I ate a whole bunch just now. Now I can't speak either. Anyway, the contagion was speedily diffused over persons of all ranks, not only the martial barons of that age, with their warlike vassals, whom the boldness of a romantic enterprise might have been apt to allure, but men in the more humble and pacific stations of life, ecclesiastics of every order, even women and children, engaged in an undertaking which was deemed sacred and meritorious. If we may credit the concurring testimony, the testimony of contemporary historians, 6 million of persons assumed the cross, which was the badge of honor, the badge of union, the badge of honor, the badge of union affixed to the right shoulder by those who devoted themselves to this holy warfare. So literally, it was on their right shoulder. It was an emblem, a badge of union. And 6 million people wore it. This frenzy, which superstitious enthusiasm had engendered and spread, was rendered durable by those extensive immunities and privileges which were accorded to the Crusaders. They were exempted from all prosecutions for debt during the time of their engagement in this sacred service. Well, I should say so. I bet you a lot of people would put that on their shoulder if their debt was taken off the grid. You betcha. So here they had all of their helpers automated. Okay, so now, unbelievable. They were exempted from paying interest on money which they had borrowed. They were exempted either entirely or at least during a certain time from the payment of all national imports. They didn't have to pay taxes either. It's incredible. Incredible. That's one way to build an army really fast, isn't it? Get you out of debt. You don't have to pay taxes ever again, and there's no interest on whatever you've borrowed. Unbelievable. They might alienate their lands without the consent of the superior lord of whom they held. Their persons and effects were taken under the protection of St. Peter. So there's a clause. And the anathemas of the church were denounced against all who should molest them or carry on any quarrel or hostility against them during their absence on account of the holy war. They enjoyed all the privileges of ecclesiastics and were not bound to plead in any civil court, but were declared subject to the spiritual jurisdiction alone. They obtained a plenary remission of all of their sins, and the gates of heaven were set open to them, without requiring any farther proof of their penitence than their engagement in this sacred expedition, which tended to gratify their favorite passion, the love of war. When both the civil and ecclesiastical powers were thus ambitious to outvie outvie each other, and to exhaust their fertile invention for the purpose of devising expedients to encourage, propagate, and confirm the spirit of superstition, it is not surprising that it should become so universal as to inflict the stigma of cowardice and the mark of infamy on everyone who was possessed of sufficient prudence or philosophy to escape the general frenzy, and to decline engaging in the holy war. So if you didn't join up, you were pretty much given the stigma of coward. The multitude of the adventurers soon became so great that their more sagacious leaders, Hugh, Count of Vermandois, brother to Philip, Raymond, Count of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, Princess of Brabant, and Stephen, Count of Blois, became apprehensive lest the greatness itself left the greatness itself of the armament lest the greatness itself of the armament should disappoint its purpose. And they permitted an undisciplined multitude, computed at 300,000 men, to go before them under the command of Peter the Hermit and Gautier the Moneyless. We'll call him Gautier the Moneyless. These men took the road towards Constantinople, through Hungary, Bulgaria, and trusting that heaven, by supernatural assistance, would supply all their necessities. They made no provision for subsistence on their march. They soon found themselves obliged to obtain, by plunder, what they had vainly expected from miracles, and the enraged inhabitants of the countries through which they passed, gathering together in arms, attacked the disorderly multitude and put them to slaughter without resistance. The more disciplined armies, there were more disciplined armies following after and passing the straits at Constantinople, were mustered in the plains of Asia, and amounted in the whole to the number of 700,000 combatants. Amidst this universal frenzy, which spread itself by contagion throughout Europe, especially in France and Germany, men were not entirely forgetful of their present interest, and both those who went on this expedition and those who stayed behind entertained schemes of gratifying, by its means, their avarice or their ambition. The nobles who enlisted themselves were moved, from the romantic spirit of the times, to hope for opulent establishment in the East. No, they're going to go see great places in the East. The chief seats of arts and commerce during those ages, well, they were the feats of arts and commerce. So in a weird odd way, they're going a little bit on a tourist journey. The first group, though, forgot to bring food, and so they turned into pirates and pillagers along the way, and ended up in wars. So now we're having so here they are under the arts and commerce during those ages. I know how incredible. And in pursuit of these chimerical projects, they sold at a very inadequate price their ancient castles and inheritance, which had now lost all value in their eyes. So it was like a going out of, everything was on sale, their castles were on sale. So what do you call that? It was it's not a seller's market anymore, it's a buyer's market. They created a buyer's market. Going cheap. All of Europe. Okay, so the greater princes who remained at home, besides establishing peace in their dominions by giving occupation abroad to the inquietude and martial disposition of their subjects, took the opportunity of annexing to their crown many considerable fiefs, either by purchase or by the extinction of heirs. The Pope frequently turned the zeal of the Crusades from the infidels against his own enemies, whom he represented as equally criminal with the enemies of Christ. The convents and other religious societies bought the possessions of the adventurers, and as the contribution of the faithful were commonly entrusted to their management, they often diverted to this purpose what was intended to be employed against the infidels. Among the leaders of the Crusades was Robert, Duke of Normandy, whose intrepid spirit prompted him to embrace an expedition endeared by the prospect of danger. For the trifling sum of 10,000 marks, he mortgaged Normandy during his absence to his brother, who had already defrauded him of the crown of England, and the inconsiderable pittance which he had raised at the expense of the scanty remnant of his father's ample territory was freely dedicated to the service in which he embarked. The Holy Wars gave rise, among various other innovations of greater importance, both in commerce and manners, it gave rise to the establishment of the three religious and military orders of knights, Hospitallers, Templars, and Teutonic Knights. The first of these, which was served as a model to the others, had acquired a high degree of celebrity, even before the capture of Jerusalem by the Crusaders. But a part of them being employed in receiving the faithful who went to visit the Holy Sepulchre, and the rest attending to the sick, they were solely occupied in works of charity under the conduct of Gerald, the founder of the order. Raymond Dupuy, a gentleman of Dauphiné, was the first who, in their primitive statutes of hospitality, added the obligation to take up arms against the enemies of the Christian religion. He divided his order into three classes. The first was that of knights, who on account of their birth and the rank they had formerly enjoyed in the army were defined to make war after the infidels. The second class consisted of those who, neither being descended from a noble family nor attached to the church, were appointed to serve the poor in the hospitals, and the knights in their military expeditions. These were called serving brothers. They were afterwards distinguished by priests and chaplains, who, besides discharging their functions at church and with the sick, were obliged to follow the army. All of them took vows of chastity and obedience. The new members, in order to distinguish themselves from the rest, affirmed the appellation of the Knights of St. John, from the name of a hospital which they had in the city of Jerusalem, and they wore a black dress with a white cross. This was the celebrated order which, under the name of the Knights of Rhodes and of Malta, filled the universe with the same of its exploits and of its victories. Well, I believe the fame of its exploits, and it could be either, and of its victories over the infidels. In order, says the Abbé Valli, not less esteemed for the peaceful virtues of religion than for the splendor of its military achievements. All right, I'm going to stop there for today. Getting on with the Crusades, how exciting.